Hayes International's 35th floor smelled faintly of lemon polish and new leather, a scent that, for Benjamin Hayes, had long since come to mean order. The glass conference table gleamed under the soft grid of recessed lights. Outside, Manhattan blurred into a ribbon of water and steel. Inside, 3 assistants had left one after another in a week, each exit as neat and anonymous as a stack of dismissed resumes. Margaret Hayes, in a cream suit that swallowed the room like a small, polite storm, tapped her fingernail on the mahogany and said, with a voice that had brokered treaties and marriages, "We are not hiring another clone. Find me someone who will make him laugh, not someone who will smooth him." A pause. Benjamin, whose decomposed morning routines had been rebuilt into calendars and caretakers, looked at the map on the screen. He felt the metal of his chair like an old promise. It held him steadier than his own hands. He said, "Someone from where I grew up." Margaret smiled, as if she had wandered back to a memory of her own and found it comfortable. "Then I shall hire the town," she decided. She had ways. Charitable trustees, a cursory phone, a mention at the charity auction, and within days a letter arrived, hand-scrawled and earnest, from a woman who taught second grade 2 towns over, ran a weekend tutoring program, and kept a mismatched mug collection on her tiny windowsill. Her name was Nora Harrison. The signature was a looping thing, the kind of hurried, tender handwriting that belongs to people who are always saving other people's miniature. Birthdays, permission slips, scraped knees. 2 days later, Benjamin boarded a train that smelled of coffee and static, his passport of appointments folded into the pocket that held his therapist's notes. He did not tell his executive team he was going. The 35th floor could tidy itself. He needed to see, privately, something that had lived inside the dusted corners of his memory for 15 years. Nora's classroom smelled of crayons, lemon-scented disinfectant, and the faint, comforting tang of the apple-scented hand soap her mother insisted on. Sunlight tilted through the blinds in uneven stripes across the posters, multiplication tables in bright lamination, a weather chart with cartoon clouds, a felt map of the town where the little dots of yarn marked every student's home. Her desk was not neat. It was staged with purposeful chaos. A stack of overdue library books, a jar labeled Lost and Found, small things, a chipped mug with a snail painted on the side that had been a gift from a parent. "Okay, Nora," she told herself under her breath, the phrase a private drumbeat she used when the list of things to do felt like a cliff. The words steadied her as she moved through the morning chorus of kids. She read them a story about a very brave mouse. The children listened the way only small humans can, wholehearted, with their knees under tables. And their attention, like hands reaching. She corrected a letter's shape with the gentlest of fingers and stored a secret giggle when a boy mispronounced hippopotamus as hippopotamus. The classroom was a small, loud world that Nora loved like an old, stubborn dog. She had been 20 when Benjamin left for Boston on a scholarship and a promise that he would return. She had waited. She had written. She had watched a mailbox receive a succession of polite, increasingly sparse sentences. She had learned to fold absence into the margins of her life. She had kept a photograph of them on a shelf, edges softened by thumbprints. She had built a life in the town that remembered the names of the streets and the kids who ran barefoot in summer. When a woman from the district office called to arrange for a corporate visitor, Nora assumed it was to shake hands with the sponsor or accept a grant. She did not expect Benjamin Hayes to be the name on the itinerary. She certainly did not expect the dark-suited man in the wheelchair who rehearsed a quiet smile and who seemed, in the bright spill of the school corridor, both smaller and larger than the boy she remembered. He arrived at the elementary school like a secret. The doorway framed him in a line of light. His jacket was buttoned against the October chill. He watched the children with a slow, close curiosity, as if cataloging something he thought he had misremembered. When Nora stood in the doorway and he realized who she was, the air between them rearranged itself into 1,000 years of small, ordinary moments. The way she had tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous, the sound of her laugh in a room that was sometimes too loud for him back then, the splinter of sunlight that used to catch on her watch. He did not expect the thing that happened first. It was small, an accidental human thing. A student came barreling toward him with a picture, sticky with glitter. Benjamin, caught by surprise, reached to take it and misjudged the moment. The boy slipped, tiny feet skidded on linoleum. Nora's hand went out before her mouth could decide to scream. Everything happened in fractions. A child's elbow, a soft thud, a chorus of halting gasps. Benjamin's shoulders shifted, the wheelchair catching a seam in the floorboards. A sound escaped his throat that wasn't planned, a sharp, involuntary intake. And then he was crying. Not the theatrical waterworks of the movies, quiet shaking at the edges, like a cup trembling on a table. Nora, who had not said his name in 15 years, found herself saying it now as if the word could catch him and set him down gently. "Ben," she said, and in the way she said it, the years collapsed into a single breath. He looked at her as if the question had been waiting its entire life to be answered. "I didn't mean to," he said, his voice low. He looked away, then back. "I didn't think I'd—" Tears slid along his jawline, catching the light. The children stared. A small hand placed a picture of a rainbow into Nora's palm, and she laughed through the wetness in her throat because that is what she had trained herself to do, tend the immediate wound before the big one stood up. Later, in the teacher's lounge over coffee that tasted too bitter, he told her something he had not told anyone else. He had been in a crash years after he left. The hospital rooms blurred into numbers and faces and people who asked him to try to remember how to move a hand. He had learned to translate grief into schedules. He had become efficient at living inside constraints, at delegating his fear. Nora listened, balancing a paper cup between her palms. She recognized the cadence of someone who had tried to purchase certainty and found only bills. She recognized, too, the image of the boy who had once pushed her on the rusting swings behind the high school, his feet kicking at riotous air. There was a tenderness in his sadness that made her want to soothe him, and a grief in his eyes that made her want to shake him by the shoulders and tell him that leaving had not been the only way. "Why did you come here?" she asked finally. And there was no schoolroom in that question, only two people trying to be careful with each other. He smiled, the kind of smile that had once knocked over towns. Margaret said, she said, someone with the way you do things could change a man. She was polite about it. I wanted to see what she'd found. He did not say the truer, more private thing, that he had a photograph in his wallet of a small fair where a girl with a crooked grin had let him win a cotton candy heart. He had tried to tell his calendar that he was done filling the blank spaces in his soul with achievements. He was tired of schedules that ran like a clock without a chime. He wanted to know how Nora had fixed herself into the world. She showed him her classroom like one might show someone a small room in one's chest. He introduced him to the students as a visitor from the big city who used to be something of a legend in our town for catching frogs. The kids giggled. One boy, no taller than a shoebox, tugged at Benjamin's sleeve and asked if the man had ever been in a spaceship. Benjamin laughed, a noise that unhitched something in him. He wheeled up to the window where Nora kept the mismatched mugs. One had a cat with a crown painted on it. Another bore a slogan about bravery that had been misprinted. He rested his hand on the chipped ceramic and was suddenly very small. A man remembered by a room. "You're a teacher," he said, as if that sentence might rearrange itself into an apology. "You stayed." She shrugged, and the shrug had the weight of a bridge. "Someone had to," she said, "and they need me, and I like it. It's loud, it's messy, it's important in ways that make my ribs ache sometimes." She laughed at the end of the sentence, as if surprised to be so earnest. Okay, Nora, she told herself, because the old drumbeat tells you to steady your hands when things move toward decisions. He watched her hands work, the way she smoothed a folded paper into place, the quick kindness she offered to a student with a split lip. When she fixed a child's braid, her fingers were careful, as if binding a small wound. He understood then, clearly, and with a sudden, unpleasant clarity, that his life had been ordered to contain everything he could control, and she had stayed in a place where the uncontrollable was the work. He had been running towards something he thought would fix him. He had not been brave enough to choose the slow, vulnerable work she did every day. The train back to the city that evening was the color of overcast brass. Benjamin looked out the window at a landscape he had once known intimately, then no longer. He thought of schedules and board meetings and the architected silence of his home. He thought of Margaret's smile and her plan. He thought of Nora's hands. He tried to tally the economy of what he had lost and what he could still gain. He found quietly that the sums did not add up to anything like peace. Back in Manhattan, the 35th floor exhaled its predictable rhythms. The team awaited the arrival of the new assistant with the kind of curiosity that smells faintly of gossip. Nora's name came up in a meeting as if she were an item added to an agenda. "We're flying her up to train with the team," Margaret announced. Her voice conducted the sentence like an instrument. "She has experience mentoring. She's done work with community programs. Benjamin wanted to meet her." There, at the juncture of policy and impulse, the story began to bend. Nora received the offer like a surprise note folded into the shoes of her life. The school district agreed to a sabbatical. Parents reassured one another. Daniel, her brother, who kept everything practical and warm, made jokes about Nora trading in a chalkboard for a touchscreen. "You'll like the snacks in the break room," he said, which was his way of naming worry and not naming it. On the day she boarded the bus that would take her to the train to the city, Nora stood on the platform with a knitted scarf and a small suitcase. Lord Whiskers, the cat she had adopted from the shelter and whose sullen majesty dominated her apartment, sat on the windowsill and flicked his tail, as if the world was entertaining him for a moment. She folded a note into the pocket of her sweater with a list. Keys, emergency contacts, Daniel's number, permission forms for the tutoring program. She breathed and said, out loud this time, "Okay, Nora, you can do this." The city hit her like a wall of glass and taxi horns. The 35th floor smelled like lemon polish and the meaning of other people's schedules, and the marble that led to Benjamin's office was cold under her shoes. The assistants in the bullpen watched her like a living rumor. She carried her own awkwardness like a mantle, and sometimes it made her glow in ways that suited the unsmoothed surfaces of the Hayes building. Benjamin had arranged for a private tour of the floor before her first day officially began. He met her in the lobby with the same quiet smile that had been enough to make small towns rearrange themselves 15 years earlier. To his team, he was composed. To her, he was an open book with lines cut out. He apologized for crying in the school. "I wasn't ashamed," he said. "I just wasn't expecting to find you there, or to see—" He gestured vaguely, the gesture of a man who was used to precise movements and was learning the ineffable. They worked together at first with the brittle politeness of old acquaintances learning new languages. She learned the names of his rare coffees, black, no sugar, a teaspoon of patience, and the way he preferred his correspondence. He learned the way she tied her hair in a bun when she wanted to concentrate, how she kept a tiny photograph taped to her laptop of a classroom mural she had helped a student paint. There were small disasters, as there always are when two lives attempt synchronization. On her third week, she arrived late because of a broken elevator. Marble halls had old souls. The bullpen was a forest of whispers. Stella Ward, the director of PR, watched with a refined unease. She had been the architect of many reputations and smelled potential disturbances. Stella's eyes were the brilliant, appraising kind that could render someone's career into a spreadsheet. The whispered tally of the first 3 assistants in 3 days became a pretext. Stella, cautious and precise, logged concerns like a cartographer of risk. Nora's ease in crisis, her small, wild competence, began to show. An investor's call went sideways when a younger VP misread a projection. The numbers were a tangle until Nora, armed with the memory of grading tests and reading through difficult handwriting, noticed a pattern of mislabeled cells. She proposed a simple solution, one of those clear, obvious moves that make people clap in relief because it seems to come from grace rather than genius. The board took notice. But no story of thaw is linear. Benjamin's progress in therapy was steady and measured. David, the physical therapist, taught him to find small wins in repetition. The parallel bars became a place of ritual, where each step forward was both victory and a map of the months to come. He laughed more in the office, sometimes at things that were not particularly funny, and that laugh hung like a loose string that told Nora she was warming him from within. The office, however, kept its teeth. Stella saw Nora not as a helper, but as an intruder, someone who could soften Benjamin's edges and, by extension, change the course of the company. Her fear was practical. Investors favored predictability. Her methods were strategic rather than cruel. She sent memos, she questioned protocols, she asked that performance reviews be revisited. Her opposition made the team pick sides, and Nora learned quickly that corporate smiles could hide sharp things. When a charity gala approached, the kind that required velvet invitations and the right speeches, Stella maneuvered to control the microphone. On the night, the microphones did not cooperate. The main speaker's teleprompter glitched. The hall held its breath. Benjamin, slated to speak about a new educational initiative Hayes International would fund, found himself at odds with a PR machine that had been built to minimize human friction. Nora, who had once taught a class about improvisation during library time, felt a tightening in her chest. "Okay, Nora," she told herself, and stepped forward. She had, by then, been working with Benjamin enough to know the cadence of his pauses and the places where his voice needed the warmth of a story. When the microphone balked and Stella's face organized itself into the posture of someone waiting for a disaster to validate her instincts, Nora moved to the podium with a smile, with no permission but with a fierce, undeniable right. She told a story. Not about numbers or profit margins, but about a second-grade class that had painted a mural of a small sun over the high school's mural. About a boy who learned to count change and then learned to lend a pencil. About the way community looked when people were trusted to build it. The hall leaned toward her as if someone had opened a window. Benjamin watched from the front row, the light catching on his cheekbones. His hand curled around the arm of his chair. He had come to expect competence. What he had not expected was courage that smelled faintly of chalk dust. The applause was a thing that startled like rain. Stella's mouth stayed tight. She measured the storm, and then measured its edges. Later, in an office where the city hummed like distant bees, Benjamin said to her, with eyes that had been softened by what he'd watched, "You save people without thinking about rescue." She laughed, and the laugh was fierce. "I teach children how to count," she said. "That isn't rescue. That is making sure they keep doors open." She crossed her arms, and the pose was more bravado than armor. "Okay, Nora," she murmured, because courage needs naming. But the world outside the gala was not entirely held in one moment. Stella, whose motives could be read like a ledger, ambition balanced against past slights, found opportunity in an anonymous tip, an allegation of misfiled expense reports. It was a minor infraction blown up in internal channels. Stella suggested an audit. Margaret, wary and deft and motherly in a way that made Benjamin go softer, insisted on due process. HR opened a file. Witnesses were called. The company shuffled through its procedures with the slow dignity of a judge. Nora felt the office tilt beneath her feet. Imposter syndrome crouched at the back of her throat like a small, hungry thing. She had been hired for something Margaret called intangible value, and now she sat under fluorescent lights while spreadsheets and memos spelled out doubt. She wanted to run back to the classroom with its sticky-fingered children and forget the marble entirely. But Benjamin did not let her go. He stood in the HR meeting not as a man of paper and policy, but as someone who had seen her move mountains out of crumbly soil. He testified not with emotion, but with the kind of quiet attestation that cannot be manufactured. He spoke of the gala, of the patterns she had spotted in numbers, of the voices that had changed in the bullpen. He called witnesses. The investigation unfolded like a calmed storm. The charges were found to be administrative errors and miscommunications, not malfeasance. Stella, whose career was built on meticulous caution, found herself watched by a board that did not love surprises. Institutional systems took their time. Procedural meetings, legal clarifications, and mediated conversations happened in a rhythm that made the calendar a kind of slow healing. Nora, who had feared that her presence would be a footnote in a cautionary tale, discovered that competence could build a bridge over suspicion, that evidence built the architecture of vindication. When the day came that the board announced the Harrison Project, a new scholarship and mentorship program for underfunded schools that would bear Nora's last name if she wished, she felt the room spin. Benjamin had proposed it, and Margaret had advocated for it, and the board had approved with the sort of cautious excitement polished by months of committee meetings. The program was programmatic: internships, grants for classroom supplies, training workshops. It was not salvation. It was a promise written into budgets and timelines, with measured outcomes and measurable accountability. It was, Nora thought, a seed. On the morning Benjamin called her into his office afterward, the sun turned the city glass into bands of gold. He wheeled in a small ceramic mug, a mismatched thing, painted with a cat who wore a crown, and set it gently on his desk. He had watched her teach, had listened to her talk to children, had watched how her hands smoothed edges. He had found in her a way of being that he had lost somewhere between his suits and his surgeries. Nora, he said, and the word held the slow, careful weight of someone learning the limits of what he could say. Would you consider overseeing the Harrison Project? You would be directing it. It would be... He struggled for the bureaucratic term, and found instead the honest one. It would be your program, with my family's support. I think the company needs someone like you. Nora felt the familiar drumbeat in her chest. Okay, Nora. She thought of second graders learning the count, of a mural with a small sun, of Lord Whiskers curled like a comma on her windowsill. She thought of trains and lemon polish and a man who had cried in her school. She also thought, with the acute, slightly painful clarity of someone who would not make decisions out of gratitude alone, that this offer put her at a fork in the road. Accepting meant leaving classrooms for boardrooms. It meant trading the immediacy of small hands for the slower architecture of policy. It was an offer with practicalities tangled in it, a commute, a new life, an accountability she did not yet know how to name. She swallowed and asked him one question that was not about budgets or titles. If I say yes, will I be here because you want me as an assistant, or because you like the idea of the person I was when you were 16? He met her gaze, and something honest and dangerous cracked open. Because of you now, he said. Because of the way you make people better. Because of the way you teach them to stand on their own. Because I don't want to be someone who keeps people small for the comfort of the schedule. She considered the words like a thing offered across a table. In the corner of her mind, a memory of an old locker and a wrapped ribbon flashed like a lighthouse. She knew better than to leap. She also knew, with the fierce pragmatism that had made her a good teacher, that lives are made of decisions, and that courage sometimes appears disguised as paperwork. Okay, Nora, she said finally, and the phrase felt like a pact. "Give me a month. I need to set things right here. I need to tell the kids. I need to know that when I walk away, those little doors stay open." He nodded, respect in the set of his jaw. "Take as long as you need." Outside, the city carried on, as it always does. Taxis like beetles, scaffolding like lines on a hand. Nora left the building with a cardboard coffee cup and a heart that felt both heavier and newly aerated. She had stepped into the marble halls because a woman named Margaret had decreed it, and because a man she had loved had arrived with tears in his eyes. She was stepping into something larger now, but she had insisted on the one thing that mattered: agency. On the train home, she traced the edge of the ticket with her thumb. Imagining a program built not on grand speeches, but on steady work. She imagined a classroom with windows that let in sun even on the gloomiest days. She pictured the mural with the small sun and thought of the way children leaned toward light. Lord Whiskers would complain, Daniel would call. She smiled at the small, practical things, like a person who had taught herself to celebrate margins. At home that night, she found, tucked beneath a pile of papers, the photographs she had never sold to time. Them at 15, Miles full of mischief, a carnival in the background. In it, he looked like an unfinished sentence, and she looked like a promise. She set the picture beside her kettle, boiled water, and made a mug of tea. The steam tangled at the ceiling. She knew the city would ask much of her, and she also knew the world she left behind would not simply pause. She had, for years, been the person who made sure the curtain stayed open. Now she was being asked to open new ones on a larger stage. The decision sat in her like a seed, both fragile and insistent. Somewhere in the folds of satin and schedule, Stella sharpened her gaze. Some boardroom tables awaited evidence of competence. A program would require paperwork, budgets, and an announcement speech that did not fail. But for the first time in a long while, the idea of work felt like the work of choosing rather than of placating expectations. When Benjamin called her that night, and he did because he had watched her negotiate a room full of small judgments and large hopes, she answered on the third ring. They spoke softly, not like two executives coordinating a calendar, but like two people measuring their own edges against one another. He told her that the program would need someone who could speak plainly to kids and politely to donors. She told him she would not be anyone's consolation prize. "Promise me you won't try to fix everything at once," she said, half joking, half pleading. "I don't think I would know how," he admitted, "but I will try to learn." They laughed, and the laugh sealed something like a contract between two people who had known the awkwardness of youth and the complexity of middle years. It was not a promise of passion or rescue. It was, instead, a promise of presence. At midnight, when the city had tucked its neon into pockets and left the sounds of distant sirens like punctuation, Nora held the photograph up to the night. She thought of the boy who had left and the man who had returned. She thought of the way classrooms are built of tiny moments sewn together. She thought of the months of therapy and the slow, patient steps Benjamin had taken at parallel bars. She thought of the Harrison Project and the lives it might touch. She slept with a small light on and dreamed not of dramatic reconciliations, but of a mural that took years to finish, each day another brushstroke. Morning arrived, and with it the memory of the children's voices. She brewed coffee and found herself whispering the phrase as she laced her boots. "Okay, Nora." It felt less like a reminder and more like an invitation. Outside, the city waited with its marble and its lemon polish and its people who moved like the hands of clocks. Inside, a small apartment, a woman who had kept classrooms warm gathered her courage for a life which promised both marble halls and the smell of crayons. She had said yes to a meeting, not a life. Decisions would come in their time. For now, she allowed herself the small and exact pleasure of the moment. The hum of the kettle, the soft patting of Lord Whiskers at her feet, the knowledge that someone had cried because of what he had found in her. It was a salve and a hazard both. And somewhere, across the river of glass and steel, Benjamin unfurled his calendar and penciled in a visit to the classroom for the next week. He put a small, careful check next to it. He wanted to see how she would tend the kids again, wanted to measure the work he had watched from the outside. He had been a man who built schedules for people to live inside. Now he was learning to build space for people to grow. The invitation at the heart of both of them was not romance alone. It was a shared project of repair. Her work in the world and his willingness to change it from within. They would fail sometimes. They would get it wrong. But they had, for the first time in many years, chosen to show up. On a bench outside the school, a small boy held out a drawing to Benjamin the following week. It was of two people under a sun. The figures were disproportionate, hands enormous, smiles a little crooked. Benjamin looked at the sun and understood that what he had cried for in that first corridor had not been a plea for pity, but a recognition of full, stubborn life. When he asked the boy what the drawing meant, the boy said, with the bluntness of children, "That's Mrs. Harrison. She makes the sun." Benjamin laughed, and the sound was wetter this time, because it carried the weight of gratitude. He turned to Nora and nodded. She returned the nod with something like an offering. "Okay, Nora," she breathed one last time, a benediction to herself before the work began in earnest. There were storms to come, PR scrapes and firings narrowly avoided, Stella's maneuvering, the public scrutiny of their unusual partnership. There would be therapy sessions that tested the boundaries of patience. There would be times when the elevator would get stuck and someone would need to fix a plan with trembling hands. But in the immediate arc of that day, a man had visited his ex-girlfriend after 15 years and cried not for loss, but for witness. He had cried for the woman who had become a son. It was a small beginning, but beginnings are where the light starts. Nora walked back into her classroom and found her students waiting. Benjamin wheeled to the window and watched the way a teacher's hands moved. Outside, Manhattan kept its own slow, relentless counting. Inside the small-town school, for once, the sums added up to something that could be named and shared. And somewhere in between, decisions waited. A month, a program, 1,000 small choices that would prove whether a company and two people could be better than they had been. For the first time in a long while, Nora felt not only invited but chosen for who she was, and Benjamin felt not simply privileged but responsible for what he had seen. They would learn together how to hold that. She closed the classroom door with a soft click and, on the walk home, allowed herself to imagine a mural that could cover not only a wall but also a life. The image felt enormous and slightly ridiculous and real. She smiled into the cold and said, as she always did, "Okay, Nora." And the world, for that small, miraculous beat, answered back with possibility. She slept with the window cracked that night, the city air moving like a hand across her face. Dreams came in fragments, children whose heads were suns, a mural that kept bleeding into new colors, Benjamin standing at the doorway with an unreadable smile. She woke with a paint smell phantom at the back of her throat and the steady, ridiculous conviction that she could find a way to make something that did not belong to any of them, neither to the school, nor to the company, nor to the press, become all of theirs. The first week after his visit moved with the careful awkwardness of people learning new muscles. Benjamin showed up more often than his calendar strictly allowed. Once to sit quietly in the back of a room during story time, once to read a clumsy picture book about bridges and bravery, once to bring a stack of mismatched crayons that the janitor eyed as if they were contraband. Each time he left with more color smudged on his fingers than the last. He was learning to be present without performing, and that was harder for him than anyone admitted. Stella, meanwhile, began to test the seams. She did it with the professional gentleness of someone who had spent a career trimming comfort into weapons. Her first move was a carefully placed email, just enough praise mixed with a caveat about perception, and then a lunch with a reporter who asked in a tone that smelled of lemon and sharpened curiosity whether the company's involvement was merely a PR exercise. Her questions were public, phrased as concern. Her subtext was a chess move. It did not take long for a headline: "Firm's New Education Initiative. Genuine aid or strategic publicity." The piece quoted an anonymous, concerned board member, the phrase dressed in careful distance. The school community bristled. A parent on the PTA sent a message asking for clarity. A local television crew asked for permission to film outside the school. Someone on social media, someone whose name Nora did not know but whose voice had the ease of online certainties, accused the company of brand-washing a classroom. Nora felt the old instincts, the crouch of self-preservation she had learned after years of being thanked and then judged, pull at her. It was a familiar ache. Do the work quietly until it is too late for anyone to complain. She wanted to retreat into the classroom's warm headspace, where crayons had no agendas and where children draped their trust over her like a blanket. But retreat felt like an abdication. The kids had already started to call the project the Sun Painting, and that name belonged to no press release. She had to choose whether to let the momentum be numbered and measured by someone else's agenda or to press the messy human thing forward. Benjamin called that evening. "They asked me to brief the board," he said without preface, as if the words themselves were a small, necessary apology. "There will be questions about oversight, about funding, about how we measure outcomes." "Will you tell them about the drawing?" she asked. The image of the child handing over his son remained stubborn in her mind. He laughed softly. "I already did," he said. "More than once. I showed them the drawing of two figures with huge hands. I told them I cried." There was something profound and absurd in the admission. How a man who made schedules for a living could be undone by a child's son. "Good," Nora said. "Then let them ask for metrics. We'll give them real ones." Real metrics, she knew, were not numbers alone. They were the way Mia, who had been absent for a month, asked to stay after because she wanted to finish a shading on a rainbow. They were the hush of a room when a boy named Theo read aloud for the first time. They were the way parents stayed later and listened when she explained how color could be a language. But she also knew budgets spoke in different tongues, that philanthropic gestures were often translated into capital-sounding phrases. ROI of social programs, brand alignment, stakeholder value. Those words made her mouth taste like tin. They decided to meet the next morning before the school opened. In the hallway, under a strip of institutional light that made the linoleum look like a stage, Benjamin brought out a packet he had made. A simple outline of the program's goals, a timeline, a community engagement plan. It was tidy in the way that a businessman finds comfort. One list for each anxiety. Nora added another piece, a running sheet of what the kids needed. New brushes, quieter stools. Gloves for the art club leader who had been painting with an old arthritis that hummed like an insect. "Tell them the truth," she said. "Tell them what we already have, who we've lost, who we've found. If you tell them the sun, they'll understand." Benjamin held her gaze, the announcement of his growing patience. "I'll tell them the sun," he said. He flinched only once, as if admitting the phrasing made him vulnerable. Then he folded the packet and tucked it into his briefcase like a talisman. Word of the board briefing leaked in knots, one person to another, a string of speculation. The school principal called to say she would speak in Benjamin's favor, but asked that they present a community-facing event first, an open studio where parents could see the children painting, where conversation could replace rumor. It was a shrewd move. Visibility, when managed honestly, was the only antidote to insinuation. Nora agreed to the open studio with a caveat. The children would lead, not parents, not PR, children. The principal laughed at her insistence but conceded. "You want the kids to run the show? Fine. They will give better press than any prepared speech." They set a date and made flyers with block letters and wobbly suns. The week that followed became a collage of small, urgent tasks. Paint ordered, extra smocks sewn from beat-up sweatshirts, volunteers coordinated with the nervous diplomacy of a person arranging flowers for a funeral, delicate hands, a wish for quiet beauty. Nora found herself asking favors of people she had never asked. Mr. Alvarez from the hardware store for an extra tarp, the janitor for a ladder he had kept in a shadowed closet, a young art student from the community college who loved children and who made decorated placards that said, "We make sun." The night before the event, a storm swept the city with blunt, indecent wind. The neighborhood lights blinked as if in solidarity. Nora lay awake, rehearsing contingencies that were both practical and absurd. What if a television truck parked too close? What if someone asked about the company's motives and no one had words? What if the mural idea fractured into an argument of opinions and left nothing but a sandy hole in the wall? At dawn, she brewed coffee and stood at the window watching a pair of birds quarrel over a discarded bag of bread. The mundane world, indifferent and infinite, held steady. She packed the last of the smocks and kissed Lord Whiskers on the head, who looked up with the inscrutable patience cats wear like cloaks. "Okay, Nora," she whispered, not as benediction now, but as a steadying instruction. The open studio moved like a small miracle. News vans and a cautious blogger arrived, but the room itself was a cathedral to clumsy, earnest hands. Children set up their stations like teams before a play. Parents arrived in a hesitant flow, bringing skepticism on their tongues, but curiosity in their pockets. Mother, who had once spoken at a PTA meeting about outsiders, came and stood in the back with her arms folded. After an hour, she approached the paint table and before either Nora or Benjamin could stop her, dipped a finger in blue and put it beside her child's yellow. The two colors made a green that surprised them both. Benjamin arrived with a tray of cardboard signs he had made with the help of a nervous intern. His presence was neither flashy nor absent. He moved through the room like someone who had learned that purpose was a work of attention. He met Stella's reporter. Stella had been inside the building early, hovering with the ease of someone who loved to be in the frame. And instead of a terse exchange, he offered her paint on his knuckle. The reporter hesitated, then laughed with an honest disbelief that was almost the sound of reconciliation. The TV cameras captured hands, not speeches, and that made all the difference. There was a moment, late in the afternoon, when a boy whose mother had kept him indoors for months because she feared the city, asked to stand on a stepladder to help with the upper edge of the mural. His knees shook. Nora steadied him with the soft, precise authority of someone who had stood beside frightened children for years. The crowd hushed. He painted a crude, triumphant line, and the room erupted in small cheers that felt like an offering. A parent named Elaine, whom Nora had met only once at a conference table, pulled Benjamin aside. "I was skeptical," she said quietly, eyes wet. "I thought this was another thing that would just come and go. But my son, he hasn't stopped talking about the colors. He asked me to bring him here." She pressed a folded photograph into Benjamin's hand, a snapshot of her son covered in flecks of paint, grinning in a way that carried the whole of a life. "Thank you," Benjamin managed, and the words were not performative. They carried weight. Stella watched these small things and adjusted, not by changing her strategy, but by perfecting the deploy of her doubt. She would still whisper to decision-makers about optics. She would still suggest measured detachment. Her power was not in being cruel, but in shaping the language of caution. Yet for the first time, she found her arguments trailing in the wake of the children's laughter, which made them seem thin and small when held up against the tangible evidence of joy. The day closed with a modest, unspectacular victory. The mural's lower half complete, the upper half sketched, the kids' fingerprints still drying in neat blooms of color. The local paper ran a small, tender piece the next morning. Classroom's new mural, city and company painting together. It was not an exposé, it was 5 paragraphs about color and the way a child named Theo had learned to read. The headline felt like a small window opening on a summer day. Then came the expense audit, a procedural request, couched in neutral language. Could they provide receipts, documentation, a breakdown of volunteer hours? Arrived like rain after the sun. Benjamin faced it with a calm that sometimes unfurled into agitation at night. He spent hours with spreadsheets, recalculating, reformatting, and then re-explaining to men in sunless suits that not every gift could be measured in dollars. "We are not laundering publicity," he told them in a meeting where everyone both wanted and feared his conviction. "We are paying for things that let children create." Stella used the process to wedge open room for her argument. "Transparency is essential," she said in a board meeting, smiling as if doing so were a kindness, "especially when partners have interests." Benjamin pushed back. "The interest here," he said, voice lowering, "is not on a balance sheet. It is in the room where a child who could not read before read aloud for the first time." A woman on the board cleared her throat and asked for a more scalable plan. Words like scalability again softened the corners of something practical into something abstract, and Nora wanted to stand up and say, "No scalability will ever teach Mia to hold a brush steady." But the room was not a place for pleas. It was a place for proposals. The audit concluded with a compromise: a monthly report on program activity, interviews with parents, a financial report, and an advisory committee that included a teacher, a parent, a company representative, and, insistently, Stella. Benjamin accepted it with the relief of a man who had avoided the cliff, and Nora accepted it with the weary gratitude of someone who knew danger was never far, but whose work had edges that could be sanded down. Therapy arrived on a Wednesday, the first session scheduled because someone somewhere had thought it wise to have professional help navigate their new public intimacy. It was not what Nora had expected. She had imagined sitting across from a therapist and dissecting motives in a way that felt surgical. Instead, they sat on a couch that had the fashionable slight sag of many therapist couches, and talked about trust in terms neither of them had used before. "Tell me about a time you felt seen," the therapist suggested, not as a trick, but as a genuine route. Benjamin thought first of a corridor with a mural, of a child offering him a drawing. Nora thought of the moment he had cried in the corridor, the way his face had shed armor and left something honest beneath. They spoke, haltingly, of fears, his of being manipulated by sentiment, hers of being a cautionary tale. They spoke of boundaries and of courage and of what it meant to be accountable not only to a board, but to the people who would live with the outcomes. Therapy did not fix things. It made them raw in an ordered way. "I don't want to be your project," Nora told her. Him at one point, voice steady. "I want to be the person you choose to stand behind when things break." "You won't be," he said. "I don't know how to be perfect at it, but I'm starting to understand that standing behind you will sometimes mean standing beside you and sometimes stepping back." The sessions that followed were small and exacting. They argued gently, like two people learning a language. Benjamin discovered that responsibility was not a ledger. It was a set of actions that sometimes looked like mundane care. Showing up at a school on a rainy day, buying replacement brushes when a child snapped theirs in half, listening without trying to fix. Nora discovered that she could ask for help without trading in dignity. She could also fail, and the world survived. Failure, when it came, arrived as a paint spill. It was not Shakespearean. A bucket overturned in the middle of a Saturday by a volunteer who had been distracted by his phone. The paint puddled like a slow, furious laugh. For a breathless minute, the world of the mural seemed to go thin, as if the whole story might be erased by one careless hand. There was a flinch of outrage in someone at the scene, a flash of accusation, carelessness, incompetence. But then a dozen small hands, children, parents, volunteers, moved to help. They turned the disaster into edges and texture. They worked with paper towels and sponges and laughter, inventing new shapes until the spill became a comet's tail, then a river of blue that connected the two biggest figures in the painting. It was a lesson in improvisation that the audit could not measure. It was also a lesson in humility, the idea that a plan could not account for everything, that beauty sometimes emerged from mistake. As the mural grew, so did the chorus of those who favored it. Teachers testified at a board hearing with quiet, precise testimonies about attendance and participation. Parents wrote emails that read like paeans. "My son asked to go to school," one said. "My daughter stopped biting her nails," said another. The city's education officer visited and smiled in a way that suggested cautious approval. The advisory committee met and, slowly, added its voice to the ledger that had been so heavily weighted toward skepticism at the start. Still, Stella did not relent. She watched, and when the chance came, she nudged a narrative into being about fairness. Were other schools being offered similar chances? Why this school and not another? The question was not illegitimate. It merely aimed a scalpel at a joint where a wedge had been inserted. Benjamin responded by drafting a plan for a pilot program that could be replicated, a way of diffusing the argument in procedural terms. It was the same man who had once built schedules for living, finding his way again to structures that carried warmth. By late spring, the mural was finished. It wrapped the low wall outside the playground in a crowded, extravagant sun world. Children with enormous hands, animals made of patchwork color, a river that had been painted with the bright, stubborn confidence of children who had never learned to be discreet about joy. A small plaque bore the names of the donors and the children involved. It also bore a phrase Nora insisted on, "Made by hands that wanted to help." The unveiling was simple: a ribbon, snips by the principal, a short speech by Benjamin that made his voice tremble as it always did when it was honest, a round of applause that sounded like neighbors leaning toward one another. Voices rose in praise and in relief. The mural would not mend everything. It would not abolish the audit or dissolve skepticism, but it had, in a material way, changed the space where children spent their days. It had given them a public artifact of their own making. Nora stood at the edge of the crowd and watched children pointing, fingers smeared with the residue of their labor. A girl named Leela traced the outline of a painted sun with her fingertip, widening her eyes in the slow revelation of ownership. Nora felt in that moment the whole of a life bending toward satisfaction. She breathed and found that the phrase, "Okay, Nora," had become not only a benediction, but a promise she could keep. Benjamin sought her out after the speeches. He took her hand in a way that was neither possessive nor performative, just proprietorial in the purest sense, proudness of someone who had helped make a thing real. "You did this," he said. "We did," she corrected. The answer was more than grammar. It was the map of the last months. They left as the sky moved toward evening. On the walk home, beneath a soft, bruised light, Nora thought about the futures that had only been hinted at when they first met. A company learning to be kinder, a teacher given room to expand, a mural that would last until the elements tired. There would be more meetings, more audits, more skirmishes with the tidy cynicism that loved to reduce everything to agendas. There would be teacher evaluations scheduled in the fall and funding rounds to navigate. There would be the inevitable human stuff, miscommunication, exhaustion, someone saying something that would need forgiveness. But there was also the truth that had begun to feel less like a miracle and more like a practice. People could choose to show up. They could keep choosing, even when it was difficult. That night, alone in her small apartment with Lord Whiskers curled on her lap, Nora opened a fresh sketchbook. She drew, not a mural this time, but a series of small suns. Different hands, different strokes, the same stubborn light. Each page was an offering and a rehearsal. Benjamin called late, his voice softer now, as if the day had wrung something tender out of him. "There's a conference," he said. "They want me to speak about the program." "About partnership. Will you?" she asked. He hesitated. "If you want me to." "I want you to," she said without thinking. It surprised her that she meant it. "But say the truth." "I will," he promised. "We'll say the sun." He laughed, and the sound was good. "Okay, Nora," he said then, catching her in the turn of her own phrase. It landed between them like a benediction. She closed her sketchbook and put it on the little table by the window. Outside, the city kept its counting. One building's lights, another's, small human beacons in a long, impartial dark. Inside her apartment, she felt a domestic sort of peace. Not the naive kind that thinks all problems vanish, but the steadier sort that comes from having done the work and survived the critiques. The next morning, Nora went to work and found an envelope on her desk. Inside was a folded note from one of the children, a sun made of pasted tissue paper, a sentence in clumsy handwriting. "Thank you for the sun." She folded the note and tucked it into her pocket like a prayer. There would be more letters. There would be more audits. There would be an accounting of everything in due time. But that day's ledger, filled with small suns and sticky fingerprints, balanced in a way that mattered. She unlocked the cabinet where they kept the leftover paints and found that the blue had almost run out. She smiled and reached for a new tube, thinking already of the next mural, the next room that might take light. Somewhere across the river, Benjamin was setting aside a speech. Less a speech, she hoped, and more a witness. They were learning, both of them, how to translate seeing into action and action into trust. Outside, as the sun climbed, the mural caught a slant light that made the colors bleed into each other in a private show. A child paused at the gate, hand to the cool metal, and looked up with the slow worship of someone who had been given a thing they had made themselves. Nora watched him and felt the world answer again. Not with fireworks, but with endurance, a steady, domestic light that might, in time, outlast any headline. She breathed in, and as she did, the phrase rose in her mouth like an old, faithful coin. "Okay, Nora." She said it aloud as she turned the key and stepped into the room, ready to begin another day of small, precise repair.